Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, love, and self-discovery. In today's story, we follow Sarah Johnson, a young woman who faces betrayal and heartbreak in the wake of her mother's passing. What begins as a struggle to preserve her mother's legacy turns into a fight for her own sense of identity and belonging. As Sarah battles the lies and manipulation of those closest to her, she learns profound lessons about family, boundaries, and the strength to reclaim her life. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I'm 25 years old. A few months ago, I graduated from the University of North Carolina with a degree in fine arts. People often think the biggest challenge for a fresh graduate is finding a job or navigating adulthood. But for me, life has always been more complex than that. My story is one of legacy, betrayal, and learning to find strength when everything feels lost. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, my world revolved around my mother, Laura Johnson. She wasn't just my mom, she was my anchor, my cheerleader, and my guide. A talented chef with a smile that could brighten the darkest day. She built a life of purpose and ensured I always had a safety net. She owned and ran a bakery that was more than just a business. It was her heart and soul poured into every loaf of bread, every pastry, every cup of coffee served with care. Sarah, she would often say, her voice warm and steady. This bakery is more than just a place to work. It's our roots, our home. No matter where life takes you, you'll always have this to hold on to. Her words carried a sense of permanence that felt unshakable, even when life around us wasn't. My parents' marriage lasted 10 years before it quietly fell apart. I was just a little girl when my father, Mark, decided to leave us. There were no dramatic fights, no bitter custody battles, just an abrupt goodbye. Before I knew it, he had married Cindy, a younger woman who seemed eager to step into the role of wife and mother. They had a daughter, Lily. Not long after, although I visited occasionally, I never truly felt like I belonged in their new family. Cindy was polite, but her warmth felt manufactured, like she was checking off a box labeled stepmother duties. "Would you like to stay for dinner, Sarah?" she'd ask in a tone that made it clear she hoped I'd say no. My father was no better, always busy with work and vague promises to catch up soon. They seemed to orbit in their own world, where Lily, their golden child, was the center of attention. She was 10 years younger than me and the apple of their eye. I'd watch Cindy braid her hair or gush over her latest drawing while I stood on the periphery, feeling like an outsider looking in. Despite all this, I tried to maintain a cordial relationship with my father. When I graduated high school, he paid for my college tuition in a lump sum, a gesture I took at face value, though it felt more like an obligation than genuine support. I convinced myself that was the best I could hope for. Little did I know that beneath the surface of these polite, distant interactions, my mother's careful plans and my father's hidden motives were on a collision course that would forever change my life. Losing my mom to cancer was the hardest thing I've ever faced. She was diagnosed when I was 17, and even as her body weakened, her focus remained on preparing me for a future without her. She taught me everything about the bakery, managing staff, handling suppliers, even balancing the books. Her foresight was her way of showing love, and I clung to it, even as the thought of losing her felt unbearable. When she passed away during the summer before I left for college, my world crumbled. Grief became my constant companion. I remember lying in bed for days, unable to eat or speak, barely processing the reality of her absence. In those moments, the bakery felt less like a lifeline and more like a reminder of everything I'd lost. It was during this time of overwhelming sadness that my father stepped in with an offer of support I hadn't expected. He, Cindy, and Lily moved into the house I had shared with my mother, claiming they wanted to be there for me. At the time, I was too numb to question their motives. I welcomed the presence of people, even if our relationship had always been strained. "We're here for you," Sarah, my father said, his hand resting on my shoulder in what I can only describe as a calculated gesture of comfort. Cindy nodded along, her face carefully arranged to look sympathetic. Even Lily, with her curious eyes, seemed to make an effort, chatting with me about her school and friends. It felt strange but almost comforting, like borrowing a family that was never really mine. As the summer passed and my college start date approached, I faced a difficult decision about the house. Selling it was unthinkable. It was my mother's legacy, the place she had built for us with so much love. But leaving it empty while I went away didn't seem practical either. That's when my father proposed an idea. "Sarah," he said one morning over coffee, "why don't we stay here while you're at school? We'll take care of the bills, maintain the place, and you won't have to worry about anything." Cindy chimed in from the kitchen, flipping pancakes. "It would be good for everyone. Lily loves her school here, and the house will be in great hands." At the time, it seemed like a reasonable solution. I was grateful for their offer and left for college with the belief that the house and my mother's memory would be cared for. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind that I might never fully reclaim. Looking back, I can see the cracks that were already forming, even in those early days. But at the time, I wanted to believe in their goodwill. I wanted to believe in the idea of family, however fractured it might be. What I didn't know was that their presence in my mother's house wasn't just temporary, it was the beginning of a battle for everything she had left behind. And I was about to learn just how fragile trust could be. College was a whirlwind. Between classes, assignments, and late-night study sessions, my life felt like it was moving at a relentless pace. Coming home for breaks was a small reprieve from the chaos, a chance to reconnect with the house that held so many of my mother's memories. But each time I returned, I noticed subtle, unsettling changes. At first, they seemed harmless enough. The furniture was rearranged, new curtains were hung, and the house felt different. Cindy's touch was everywhere: centerpieces on the dining table, new rugs, and small changes that seemed to slowly erase the warmth my mother had cultivated. "I thought it could use a fresh look," Cindy would say with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just part of sharing the space. But as the years passed, these changes began to feel less like updates and more like a quiet takeover. By the time I graduated, the house hardly resembled the home I had grown up in. The day I returned home for good, freshly armed with my degree and a sense of purpose, I was eager to settle into a life that felt like mine. I had landed a job in Charleston, and the thought of starting my career while living in the house my mother had left for me felt like a comforting full circle. But that sense of comfort evaporated the moment I tried to unlock the door. The key wouldn't turn. Confused, I tried again, jiggling it slightly, but it was no use. Annoyed and baffled, I knocked loudly, expecting someone to answer and explain why the locks had been changed. Cindy opened the door after a moment, her expression shifting from surprise to discomfort in an instant. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice hesitant, as if my arrival was unexpected. "What do you mean?" I replied, wheeling my suitcase into the entryway. "I live here. This is my house." The living room looked even more foreign than before. New furniture arrangements, a different rug, and an air of detachment hung in the space. Something was wrong. Why were the locks changed? I demanded. Before Cindy could answer, my father appeared from the living room. His face was pale, and his usual air of awkward discomfort seemed magnified. Let's talk in the office," he said, avoiding my gaze. The small office had always been my mother's space, filled with her books and certificates, a reflection of her hard work and love for order. Now, it felt heavy, like the room itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. My father closed the door behind us and turned to face me, his hands trembling slightly. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you." I frowned. The alarm bells in my head growing louder. What is it? Dad? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck, a telltale sign he was nervous. Cindy. Cindy thinks this house belongs to me. I stared at him, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? Mom left this house to me. It's in her will. He nodded, his eyes still avoiding mine. I know that. But when we moved in, I told Cindy it was mine, that I'd given it to your mom after the divorce and that when she passed, it came back to me. His words hit like a punch to the gut. You lied to her. For 4 years. You let her believe this was your house. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I didn't think it would matter. You were at college. And we needed a place to stay. I thought it would be temporary. Temporary? I hissed, my anger rising. This is my house. Dad. Mom's house. And you're telling me you've been living here, letting Cindy act like it's hers, while you lied to her and to me. He looked defeated. I was going to tell her the truth. His words rang hollow. Before he could say more, there was a sharp knock at the door. Cindy's voice, tinged with impatience, called out, "Is everything okay in there?" I turned back to my father, my voice cold and steady. You've already had 4 years. Dad. I'm done waiting. That moment marked the beginning of a shift I hadn't fully prepared for. It was no longer just about grief or moving on, it was about reclaiming what was mine. The house wasn't just a physical space, it was my mother's legacy. And I wasn't about to let them erase it. What I didn't realize yet was just how much they'd already taken, and how far they'd go to hold on to what was never theirs to begin with. The days following that confrontation were tense, to say the least. My father avoided me as much as possible, leaving the house early in the morning and returning late at night. Cindy's politeness dissolved into something sharper, colder. It started with subtle jabs masked as helpful suggestions. "Sarah," she said one morning, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "I reorganized the pantry for efficiency. You probably didn't notice since you've been so busy with college." She smiled, but her eyes gleamed with something close to triumph. Then there were the accidents. My favorite blouse came out of the laundry streaked with bright pink dye. Cindy feigned concern, clasping her hands to her chest. "Oh dear," she said, her voice insincere. "I must have mixed up the laundry baskets. These things happen when the house gets too crowded." Even Lily, who had once seemed eager to spend time with me, now mirrored her mother's disdain. She rolled her eyes whenever I entered a room and began referring to me as that girl in conversations I overheard. "Mom says it's weird she's still here," I heard her whisper one evening, her words cutting deeper than I expected. Cindy's passive-aggressive comments soon turned into outright hostility. One evening, as I poured myself a cup of coffee, she cornered me in the kitchen, arms crossed and her expression icy. "Sarah, have you thought about getting your own place?" she asked, her tone casual but her words pointed. "You're starting a new job soon. It's time to think about living independently. You're a grown woman, after all." I tightened my grip on the mug, forcing myself to stay calm. "Actually, I've talked to Dad about staying here for a while. He's fine with it," I replied, meeting her gaze with quiet defiance. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. Instead, she turned and left the kitchen without another word. But her actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. The next morning, I woke to find the living room completely rearranged. My mother's favorite vase, a beautiful ceramic piece she'd cherished for years, had been moved to a dusty corner shelf. It didn't match the new aesthetic, Cindy said when I confronted her, her tone dismissive. My frustration grew, but I tried to keep my composure. I knew any argument would only escalate the situation. And deep down, I was still holding out hope that my father would step in, would say something, would do anything to stop this. But he remained silent, a shadow of the man I once thought he was. Family dinners became battlefields. Cindy cooked just enough food for 3 people. then feigned surprise when I joined them at the table. "Oh, I didn't think you'd be here for dinner," she'd say. Her tone light but her eyes cold. Lily would giggle at her mother's remarks. And my father would sit quietly, avoiding confrontation as if his passivity absolved him of any blame. The isolation was suffocating. I found myself retreating to my room more and more, avoiding the hostility that seemed to follow me around the house. Even there, I couldn't escape the heavy weight of betrayal. This wasn't just Cindy's doing, it was my father's. His silence, his complicity, hurt more than anything Cindy or Lily could have said or done. He was the one who had allowed this to happen, who had let my mother's house become a battleground for power and control. I poured myself into my new job, hoping the distraction would help ease the tension at home. My co-workers were kind, and the work was challenging in a way that made me feel alive again. But every evening, as I drove back to the house, that familiar dread crept in. The closer I got, the heavier it felt, like the air itself was warning me to stay away. One Saturday morning, the house was eerily quiet. No sounds of Cindy baking in the kitchen, no music blasting from Lily's room, and no faint murmurs of my father watching sports in the living room. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath. I slipped out of bed and padded downstairs, calling out, "Hello, Dad, Cindy." There was no response. The kitchen was spotless, untouched since the night before. The living room looked staged, the throw pillows perfectly arranged, even the usual clutter, Lily's shoes. Cindy's handbag was gone. A quick glance outside confirmed it. My father's car wasn't in the driveway. I checked my phone, expecting to find a note or a text message explaining their absence. But there was nothing. Confused, I dialed my father's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again, then reluctantly called Cindy. She picked up on the fourth ring, her voice sharp and impatient. "What do you want?" "Sarah," she snapped. In the background, I could hear waves and faint tropical music. "I just wanted to know where everyone is," I said, caught off guard by her tone. "I woke up, and the house is empty." She laughed, a harsh, mean sound that made my stomach turn. "Oh, didn't we tell you? We're in the Maldives. First-class flights. Luxury resort. The works." Her voice dripped with mockery. "We didn't mention it because, frankly, we didn't want you tagging along and expecting us to pay for you." I stood there, stunned, her words echoing in my mind. "Madison, what are you talking about? You left without saying anything." "Save it," she interrupted, her tone icy. "When we get back, I want you gone. Pack your things and leave. You're nothing but a freeloader squatting in a house that doesn't even belong to you." And with that, she hung up. For a moment, I stood frozen, the phone trembling in my hand. But then, something inside me shifted. The sadness and disbelief gave way to something else, anger. White-hot, focused anger. This wasn't just a house. It was my house. My mother's house. And I wasn't going to let them take it from me. As I stepped out of the car, Cindy stormed toward me, her voice rising with anger. "How dare you change the locks?" she shouted, while my father stood awkwardly by the car, avoiding eye contact. I walked past her, calm but resolute. "This is my house," I said firmly. "It always has been. My mother left it to me, and I won't let you erase her memory." Cindy's anger turned to desperation. But I didn't waver. I watched as they packed their things, their shouts fading into the distance. The house, quiet once more, felt like mine again, truly mine. That evening, I stood in the garden, gazing at the roses I had replanted in my mother's honor. In the stillness, I felt her presence, her love. The future was uncertain, but I was ready to rebuild, stronger, wiser, and deeply rooted in the legacy she left behind. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring videos.